On behalf of Bloomberg, I would like to thank ISDA for the opportunity to share Bloomberg's role as the adjustment service vendor for LIBR FBAKs that ISDA is implementing for certain IBORs. My name is Edmund Lee, and I'm from the OTC Data Strategy Department, and I'm based in Hong Kong. I would also like to thank ISDA for working with Bloomberg on this set of slides, which we used on the 9th November event in New York, where my Bloomberg colleagues spoke jointly with ISDA's Jonathan Martin, Director of Market Infrastructure. Now, for the aim of global coordination, we are using the same deck of slides. So over the next few minutes, I will run through an overview of the main calculations in the methodology and the determination of the accrual period for the adjusted reference rate and the median period for the spread adjustment. Following that, where the fallback data can be assessed, along with commercial usage terms, and finally, where additional and useful resources can be found. It is important to note that the fallback methodology determined through ISDA's consultations cannot be changed, and should there be some extraordinary justification under which to consider doing so, a new market consultation would likely be required first. Now, at a high level, the all-in fallback rate is just made up of a sum of two components, an adjusted reference rate and the other, a spread adjustment. The adjusted reference rate is just simply the overnight risk-free rate, or RFR compounded, for the appropriate tenor, the underlying LIBOR, and the key takeaway point is that it is set in arrears. This means that these calculations are not forward-looking. The spread adjustment is the median spread between the IBOR and the adjusted reference rate over a historical 5-year period, and it gets frozen or crystallized once an IBOR cessation event is triggered. Now, moving on to the calculations. This looks quite daunting, but I would like to break that down for you. So first, the adjusted reference rate, there are three factors. Working from right to left, the first formula is simply the compounded RFR for the appropriate tenor, be it 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, and so on. The second formula is the annualized factor, so that the compounded rate is for a particular term, be it for 1 month, 3 months, etc. And we need to express it as an annualized rate, and that's the second factor on the 1 over delta term. And then finally, all of this is expressed within the day count convention, the RFR, and we need to translate that into the day count convention for the LIBOR, and that is the last factor, which is the ratio of the day count after the relevant IBOR to the day count of the risk-free rate. The Bloomberg Index Service, known as BISL, has the specific methodology for calculating this compounded rate, which is laid out in the rulebook that is available on the Bloomberg terminal at ISDA Go, and you can download that in PDF form. Let's move on to the accrual period for the ARR calculation. So we talk about the formula, but what accrual period do we use for the purpose of calculating this adjusted reference rate? So, with this illustration, let's look at a 1-month example. The blue box is the rate record date, or the IBOR record date. And starting from the IBOR record date, we are going to count 2 days, assuming it is the US dollar at spot, 2 IBOR business days. We are going to count 2 reference rate business days to land us on the orange box, which is the start date, or rather, the spot date for the accrual period. From there, we work backwards and subtract 2 reference business days and land on the green box. And this looks like quite a lot of fixing calculations. The whole point here is we need to produce an accrual period so that the end date of this accrual period is designed to land 2 days before the payment date of a contract. The working group chose not to make any changes to payment dates of a contract as a result of the consulting groups. And so what we needed to do was to design when the calculated rate is ideally available. The big idea here is that the accrual period for the ARR does not match the accrual period of the original IBOR, and that is by design. So it does need to be shifted back 2 days. So this particular example illustrates that when you shift back, you do not necessarily land on the original IBOR rate record date because it may not be a risk-free business day. And in this illustration, the accrual start date actually starts 1 day prior to the IBOR record date. Now let us move to the second component, which is the spread adjustment. And as we mentioned earlier, the spread adjustment is just the median value of the historical spread between the IBOR in question and the adjusted reference rate over a historical 5-year period. To compute the median period reference as MP in this calculation, we now go into that in some detail. For instance, working from right to left, the blue box there denotes the 18th, which is the IBOR record date, and for which we need to calculate the indicative spread adjustment. Now, bear in mind that Bloomberg is calculating these spread adjustments on an indicative basis until there is a cessation trigger event, and this will be available on a daily basis. So what we are doing here is going through that calculation on how that median period is chosen. So it's not quite 5 years from the IBOR record date. There is a bit of a subtle calculation where initially you subtract the tenor of the IBOR so that it lands us on the orange color date, which is the 18th, 1 month prior, if you're looking at this example of a 1 month tenor. Then you move backwards 2 RFR business days to land you on the 15th. And then that 15 is the median period end date. For the purpose of the calculation of the spread difference between IBOR and the underlying adjusted ARR, the interplay of IBOR fallbacks and ISDA definitions. The previous panels have gone into quite a bit of detail about the IBOR supplement and the protocol. I'm just going to highlight the most important dates that links in IBOR fallback supplement with the Bloomberg rulebook, and it's the rate record date. And this is the day that Bloomberg will publish a fallback for a particular IBOR and for a particular tenor. And we will publish the fallback rate for that rate record date towards the end of the calculation period. And the way this is linked in to the ISDA definitions and the IBOR fallbacks is if and when the fallback is triggered, then the fallback rate is the rate for the rate record date. That coincides with the fixing date of your floating rate options. Another thing I would mention is in the IBOR supplement, there is a cutoff of 2 business days prior to the payment date when you observe the fallback rate. So the offset lag has been implemented by Bloomberg in the methodology so that in most situations, we should all have the input of the RFR by 2 business days prior to the payment date, and so we should be able to publish what the fallback rate is. This was considered very important by the working group in order to give participants enough time to process a payment. Also note that for the purpose of calculating a continuous data series, fallback rates are also published for original IBOR rate record days that are non-business day, which is weekdays, even though these days would not have had IBOR rates published. What is also important for the spread adjustment is the index cessation event and what the triggers are. The trigger is a public statement announcing a permanent discontinuation on the IBORs, or also a statement by the FCA that the rates is no longer representative. So the important point here is that the trigger is the announcement. And this is when the spread adjustment will be fixed. So I wanted to touch on that point as I move on to the next slide. The big idea here is for participants to focus on event 1 and event 2. Event 1 is a pre-cessation index cessation event, or in plain English, an announcement that LIBOR will no longer be representative as of that date or as of a future date. And that future date is marked as number 2. The critical idea is, on event 1, the underlying spread adjustment will be frozen from that point onwards. When the regulator or the IBOR administrator decides that an IBOR is no longer representative on that date or some future date, but before that rate in its entirety not be implemented until event 2, when the index cessation effective date has been announced. And so there is a gap here between when the spread adjustment is frozen and when the final fallback rate is implemented. Now, that's an important idea that participants here on this call should be aware of. So I do hope that the section on methodology has been useful for you. If you have not done so already, I would suggest that you take a look at the rulebook, the FAQ, the work examples for further information on these calculations, which are available under ISDA Go on the Bloomberg terminal or on the website bloomberg.com/LIBOR. Now on data availability and the timing. At the moment, we are publishing indicative rates based on historical values available. The latest risk-free rates that are published on a daily basis for all the 11 rate sets. The timings of the publication are governed by when the risk-free rates are published in the local markets. Hence, on the table on the screen here, it shows the local times that the risk-free rates are published. So we will generally publish the updated fallback rates within approximately 30 minutes of the risk-free rate being published for the local market. In case of a holiday, there's no risk-free rate to be published, then we will still update the spread adjustments. Because of the lag in the calculations, we are able to do that because we do not need the latest risk-free rates to be update the spread adjustment, and we may publish this very shortly after midnight London time, simply because the calculation can be done earlier. So where can you obtain the data? The data is generally available in the marketplace. Now, if you are a Bloomberg customer, you can see it freely available with full history on the Bloomberg terminal. You can also subscribe through a product through data license and the data feed database product. It is also freely available on the website on a 24-hour delayed basis at www.bloomberg.com/LIBOR. And other redistributors are able to take it under license to distribute to their client network as well. Just to expand it a little more, if you were to go to the Bloomberg terminal, the landing page for this data is FBAK Go. So FBAK Go, which is also referred to in the ISDA definition, updated as the page to look for the latest value. So Bloomberg publishes the table updated each day of the fallback rates and the spread adjustments, the compounded RFR components to the fallback rates on a daily basis. If you want the history or information about any of the particular tickers, you can just click into any of the tickers and tenors and go to the DES page for the description or HP for the historical data set. As ISDA earlier mentioned, there can be scenarios where multiple rate record days are published. You can access the historical values, including the rate record days, as well as the calculation days on this page. We also provide an Excel template where you can use Bloomberg API to bring together this content. There is also a worksheet where you can use within your monitor. In terms of a database injection, data feed, and data license, there are two ways you can access the data here. First is on a per security basis, and the second is bulk product. For per security, for each of the roughly 200 tickers, you can choose one or multiples of this to access value for a given date or for a historical date range. For the bulk data sets, these are aligned to the 11 IBOR fallback rates that we would be publishing or 11 data sets. You can access the related content on a go-forward basis or as a historical product. Those that want to see the data or get an idea of it, it is publicly available for free on the website, and we have a rolling 5-day historical file for each of the rate sets. Now, let me talk through the commercial details and additional resources. For usage, I've seen several questions around it, usage licenses and commercial terms involved. Essentially, there's a 2 core licenses available at the moment, either to redistribute the data through multi-vendors and so on, or to use the data within a financial product, chiefly here as a fallback rate within the ISDA documented swap or an option. So in fact, fallbacks can be used in multiple product lines, cash products, for example, FRNs, loans. It's at the discretion of the participants in those instruments. In terms of license, what it means is a usage license simply allows on a global firm worldwide basis the use of the rate as fallbacks in financial products. There are no fees to pay now until the rate are effective or the end of the first quarter of 2022. The license fees are essentially a global single annual fee to use in multiple products. There is no counting of products, no counting of users. It is simply a global firm-wide, including all affiliates license. For certain entities that are infrastructure providers, that are clearinghouses, index companies, benchmark administrators, enterprise technology providers, we have an infrastructure usage license, and as I mentioned earlier, we have a license for redistributors. Annual usage license fees for firms are waived. This is all other firms aside from infrastructure providers and redistributors. These fees are waived until the earlier of the end of the first quarter of 2020 or the index cessation effective date, or any of the IBORs in accordance with the updated 2006 ISDA definitions. Usage license fee waivers will also apply for smaller institutions with assets below $5 billion, be that assets under management or balance sheet assets for those firms that subscribe to a single rate set. For example, the US dollar LIBOR fallbacks and all the rate tenors within that. And finally, here are some additional resources available to look at either on the Bloomberg terminal, at ISDA Go, or RFR Go, and on the Bloomberg website at bloomberg.com/LIBOR. You will find we have the rulebook, a set of FAQs, sample calculations of how the fallbacks are constructed, some technical notes on the data sets, a fact sheet, and a list of tickers for each of the fallback adjusted reference rates and spread adjustment. Now, on that note, thank you for your time. Any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. We look forward to working with the industry together towards a smooth transition.
There's myself, Paul Wiley. I head risk for Asia Pacific for LCH. I'm joined by Danny Tang. Danny, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul. Thank you all to join this event today. My name is Danny Tang. I head up the product development team in OTC Clear, which is a CCP established by Hong Kong EX. I'm based in Hong Kong. So I think today we had previous sessions to cover a lot of details about the ISDA supplements and the fallback and the fallback protocol. I think in this session we will talk about how the fallback is going to implement in the clearinghouse and how it's going to apply to the new and the legacy clear transactions. So before we go to the core part of the session today, I think it's a good time to do a recap about where we are now. I think for the whole benchmark reform exercise, there's a lot of work done in the past few months, including the RFR identifications and the CCP discounting switch. Maybe I will just let Paul to kick off. Maybe Paul, you can talk about the L6 side, and I can cover the Hong Kong EX side of work.
Clearinghouses, along with everyone else in the market, have been on this journey to the new RFRs and the new fallbacks, and it follows pretty much a fairly similar path. And so clearinghouses with the obligation to clear interest rate derivatives are generally, or from LCH's perspective, I can certainly say we're the largest user of eyeballs worldwide. And so we're in an interesting position where we have the biggest position, or we're the biggest user of eyeballs, but actually we've got no position. So we've got no axe to the grind, so to speak, in this process. So we've been involved along the way with various working groups for all the new RFRs and the like, but really from a perspective that we're looking for the best outcome for the markets. And I think that's probably true for all the clearinghouses. So in that journey, I think probably the first step was to identify what the fallbacks are going to be, what the new RFRs are going to be. And then the second step from a clearinghouse perspective was really about starting to clear those RFRs and try and alongside the market and regulators to really try and build liquidity in that. And then probably the last step, but certainly one of the most important ones, was to adopt those RFRs as the new discount rates, as the new discount curves. So for LCH and for the industry, but I'll let Danny talk for himself. But for LCH in July, we shifted from discounting off Eonia to Euro STR or ESTA in euros. And in October, we shifted from discounting of Fed funds to SOFR in US dollars. Given Eonia was defined as ESTA plus a margin, when we did that process, the discount curve switch for euros, we could do it a little bit quicker because there was just the change. We needed to compensate just for the change in MPV of those trades. So we didn't have to compensate for the change in risk. And so there was a cash compensation amount for the euro switch. For the US dollar transition or a change in discount curve, there was a cash compensation for the change, but there was also a risk compensation because the underlying risk was changing from to the discount curve, and its real risk was changing from Fed funds to SOFR. So for the majority, for all our members and a large proportion of our clients, we gave them SOFR swaps and Fed fund swaps to mitigate or hedge that basis risk that they'd inherited as a result of this change, and really try and the aim of this was really to try and put people back in the same position they were previously. So with that process and with a lot of people now having those SOFR swaps, we've seen a significant increase in SOFR volumes in October since we've done that. And going back to that second point about what are the important steps, well, one of them is building liquidity, and that change in discount curve has really helped push us along that path. Danny?
Yep, thank you, Paul. So for Hong Kong EX, we have also completed the Euro discounting switch in July and the SOFR discounting switch a few weeks ago in October. So we are very pleased with the whole process, and we received good feedback from the market participants. So we offer a choice to our clearing members whether they would like to have the swap compensations, and we let the market to determine if the basis swaps were required for the discounting switch. The outcome demonstrates that most of our clearing members at our clearing venue, in particular for the price takers, they would prefer not to take the basis swap as they don't need to hedge the discounting basis between the Fed fund and SOFR. And for that reason, we didn't offer the swap compensation in our venue. But we completed the calculations of the cash compensation, and we went through the switching over the weekend and also settled the cash adjustment on the next Tuesday. The process was very smooth, and it was well planned and executed. So we have a lot of knowledge sharing and education beforehand. It went very good, and I'm very pleased with the whole process. So I think with the recap of where we now, I think, and also the discounting switch we did in the past month, I think it's a good time that we go into the core of today's sessions and how the fallbacks is going to adopt it in the clearing houses. The central objective of the fallback is to maintain the financial stability and the legal certainty of the contract at the cessation of a financial benchmark. We believe that as a CCP, we have a role to harmonize the practices across CCPs and also the bilateral markets. We will align with ISDA to include the fallback language in our clearing rules at the same time of the amendments to be adopted in the global OTC markets. So to the questions how it will be different to the bilateral market, I think technically there will be a different way to deliver, but we will get the user to the same place. In the bilateral world, there's a fallback protocol which is used to handle the legacy non-cleared transactions, which is governed by the ISDA master agreement. But for cleared trades, it's all about the CCP rulebooks. Therefore, ISDA protocol would not be cover the cleared transactions. In the case of the Hong Kong EX OTC clears, our rulebooks has a reference to the ISDA 2006 definitions. A few weeks ago, we have issued a circular to tell the market that we will adopt the entire supplement number 70 to the 2006 ISDA definition, which is known as the LIBR FBAK supplement to our contract. So this implied languages will apply to both the legacy and new contract from the supplement effective date, which is 25th of January 2021. As we are going to adopt the whole supplement 70, which means that we would also include all the details, including the pre-cessations. Again, the purpose here is to align the bilateral world as much as possible. From the clearing members' point of view, they don't need to sign up any protocol with us. For the fallback, wages will automatically incorporate into the legacy and the new contracts. So, Paul, would you like to talk about the case for LCH?
Yeah, thank you. So a very similar situation, and I guess that wouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But LCH, along with HKEX, we have a rulebook which governs what we do, and similar to them, the ISDA protocols will be incorporated within that rulebook. So they'll be updated and override or supersede the existing ones and be incorporated into our rulebook in entirety. And so that's essentially what will happen for those transactions. And as Danny said, and just for the avoidance of doubt, so it will cover all transactions that are cleared with us. There's no choice. You can't pick and choose or what transactions are covered by the new fallbacks and which aren't. It's every transaction that's covered us. And for all currencies, it's the same. And similar to that on a bilateral basis, it's probably worth mentioning that the actual legal trades don't change. And I'm sure this has been covered in another session, but the legal trades remain the same. So if you've got a LIBOR trade, it remains a LIBOR trade. It's just the calculation of the coupon that changes. So I think that's probably the key points as to how the fallbacks will be adopted into LCH and into clearing houses. Danny, do you want to go through the key dates?
Yep, sure. The next thing that we want to talk about is about the key dates. I think the adoptions of the fallback languages on 25th of January is not really a trigger itself. I think it's important to remind all of us. It's just an enrichment of the current definitions or make the languages more robust in the fallback scenario. It defines what will going to be happens and how to find the replacement rates and in the events of the benchmark cessation. The other important days obviously are the index cessation event, which the long run spread will be fixed But bear in mind that the fallback rates will not apply until the indexation effective date. I think there's a common questions on whether the original IBOR transaction would be amended or converted to the OIS transactions on the effective date. I think as Paul just mentioned, I would like to point out that neither of those announcements or effective dates would trigger amendments of a contract. We are still carrying IBOR contract, and just that after the indexation, there will be a process how to look up the replacement rate calculated based on the ARR and the spread adjustment. So that's the key date. Paul, anything to supplement?
No, look, I don't think so. As you expect, there'd be, and as you would hope, there's consistency across the industry, and that's because we're all adopting the same terminology and same language. So there's nothing to do, nothing on that side. What I would like to mention is that LCH has just gone through the process of a consultation on Eonia. And the concept of that consultation was essentially to say, well, we know Eonia is going to fail, and that's been announced, or that it will cease to exist. And that cessation date is the 3rd of January 2022. And so there was some market participants that came to us and said, well, is there any interest, or can we put out a consultation to see if there's interest to convert in mass all the trades that are cleared, all the Eonia trades that are cleared at LCH in advance of the fallback being triggered. So in advance of that 3rd of January 2022 date. And so we put out a consultation to see if there was interest for that, and provisionally put out a date of November next year, November 2021. So about 6 weeks in advance of the actual trigger date. And we've had the results of that, and we've announced it recently, and there was an overwhelming interest in terms of those people that came back in doing that. And so in November next year, for Eonia, the trades will be converted not to the fallback, which is Ester plus a margin, but to Ester flat trades. So converting the trades from Eonia trades to legally Ester trades, whereas under the fallback provision it would have stayed as Eonia trades. So we're legally changing the trades to Ester trades, and then we'll pay compensation for the change in MPV, similar to what we did for the discount curve. And that will be paid as a cash payment in November next year. And so that's kind of got a few neat things, I think, and it's certainly something to think about in terms of this fallback process. So number one, it allows the market to determine the timing as opposed to the regulators. Number two, rather than having a fairly complex situation where you've got a trade legally assigned to one name, but actually the coupon's determined off a different benchmark, it kind of solves that problem too. And it solves the problem of the fallback language where it's a new RFR or a new benchmark plus margin. So it gets rid of that because the trades are switched to the new RFR at a flat rate. So in this case, Ester is a flat rate. So I think that's kind of interesting because it in that instance, it's actually taking the fallback language or doing what the fallback language was intended to do in advance of it actually occurring. And I think that's probably something that there might be interest to do in other benchmarks as well. But obviously we'll have to wait and see on that at that point in time.
Yep, thank you, Paul. I think the Eonia part is interesting. I think that's bring us to probably the next items, or we can talk about the actual implementations of the fallback rates. I think the fallback, all we know that the fallback reform is one of the biggest challenges in the financial market history. It's a very complex, multi-dimensional task, and it's really important to have an industry organization like ISDA to lead and to establish the consensus across the world to calculate the fallback replacement rate and also establish the new definitions for the benchmark taxation. I think that the next is really depends on how the industry is going to react on such new definitions and fallback rates, and the actual implementations of putting the fallback rate into the live environment. For example, financial institutions, they will need to understand like the implications of the trade pricing, trade fixing, and all the respective credit or market risk management. So while we understand that LIBOR will continue to publish until the end of 2021, but this does not mean that we have more than a year to prepare the transitions. Apart from the legal and documentation side of work, I think system or infrastructure readiness will also be a very important part of the transitions. For example, pricing derivative transactions would depend on the correct projections of the future cash flow and discount it back to today's value. While at this point in time, we don't know the exact effective days of the index cessation event. However, once the regulators announce the cessation settings and the effective date, the way how we project the cash flow beyond the effective date could be different as to the pricing mechanism. In addition, given the milestones suggested by the regulatory bodies, new LIBOR derivative transactions maturing after 2021 may gradually disappear in the market after mid next year. We will need to observe how the RFL trading activities will pick up and how will it integrate into the pricing mechanism of the legacy LIBOR transactions. Besides, I think market participants may want to also review the impacts to the risk profile due to the changes in pricing and its rippling effects on the initial margins and funding costs. As we are getting close to the cessation event, there's also work on upgrading the existing infrastructure to support the fallback, transiting from the legal languages to the day-to-day operations. The chosen fallback is a combination of the relevant overnight RFL compounded in arrears and a fixed spreads to reflect the risk premiums associated to a term. Instead of the fixing in advance for the original IPO transactions, under the fallback, the fixing of the coupon will have to be deferred towards to the end of the coupon period and look up the fallback rate produced by Bloomberg before the coupon payment date. So I think that's a couple of points that I want to highlight regarding the implementation of the fallback. So Paul, anything to supplement?
No, look, I think we've covered that. You've covered that very well. So on that one.
Yep. I think on the next thing that I want to also mention is about the cross-currency swap. I think that there's a lot of questions around this product. As the fallback rates not only will not be only applied to the single currency interest rate swap, right? Because it will also impact to other derivatives with a reference rate to IBOR, including the cross-currency swap. So CCS will carry additional complications because the transitions or the transactions would involve actually two benchmark rates. The fallback will be applied to the individual legs in accordance to the announcement for each legacy rate. Therefore, I think we all need to be aware that tenor basis could appear if one leg moves to a fallback, fallback to the overnight rate, but not the others. And also, the fixed spreads based on the 5-year median could be calculated from a different period if the announcement is made by the different regulators at a different time. And also, there's also questions about the future conventions of a cross-currency swap, in particular for the currency or the jurisdiction with the multi-rate approach, like, for example, in Hong Kong. So we have HIBOR and Honia. So it will be interesting to see how the market would develop in the future if the CCS would be US dollar SOFR on one side for the US dollar leg versus the Hong Kong dollar HIBOR or the Hong Kong dollar Honia. I think we have prepared a poll questions on this. Maybe I think it's the right time to take a quick look on these questions.
So I think there's two questions that we've got, and hopefully you can answer on behalf of your firm or what you think is the best way to do it. But the first question is really about the wider benchmark reform piece. And so that's how are you intending to manage trades on benchmarks that may fail? So you do nothing, so keep the trades as they are and rely solely on the fallback language to manage a benchmark that fails. The second option B, to convert all the trades in advance, and so try and mitigate that benchmark failure risk and the operational risk around that by trying to get ahead of any benchmark failure. C, a combination of A or B, so a combination of rely on fallbacks in some instance and trying to reduce your outstanding notional in advance. Or D, some other approach that's not one of those first three. So I think we'll just give a minute or so for some answers to come through on that. But it's essentially, I think this is probably really the key point that we're at, and the key thing that's going to happen for 2021 is how and what firms do in this space. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, Danny?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think I'm really interested to see the results. I think a lot of press talk about in particular for Asia Pacific. I think it is interesting to see the financial institution in Asia Pacific, how they ready, or have they all be prepared for the transitions next year.
Yeah, so we'll give that a second, and the regulators have been quite vocal on this approach in saying that they're sending out Dear CEO letters in various jurisdictions around the world to make sure that everyone's got a plan and everyone has thought about this and thought about what they're actually doing. So should we see if we've got some results here at the moment? I can click over to the next slide and see. So the results being that the most popular option being a combination of A and B, so converting some of the trades in advance or trying to manage down the notional, and then a proportion of trades that are relying just solely on the fallback language, which I think is interesting because as I said before, the regulators have been very vocal in this topic or on this topic around the world, saying that fallback should be considered just that, fallbacks, and that the number one option or the plan A and plan B and plan C should be to try and do something to convert in advance, and so not rely on that. So I think that's certainly a very interesting answer. And then if we just ask the second question, which leads into what you just discussed, Danny, which was on cross-currency swaps. So cross-currency swaps being a significant product in particularly in the Asia Pacific region, and a particular tool for using funding is important to this region. So given the benchmark reform, will that actually change how your firm trades cross-currency swaps? So do you think that they will continue to, as option A says, yes, it will change how we trade them, and I expect us to start trading SOFR or an RFR versus a local RFR, so in Hong Kong, Honya, or SORA in Singapore, or AONIA in Australia? So trading RFR versus RFR, or answer B, no, actually, I don't think the market's going to change, and the current customs of using the local term benchmark will continue to be used. And so you will end up in a situation where you've got an overnight risk-free rate versus a term risky rate in something like HIBOR. So again, it's kind of an important issue and one that the market's grappling with at the moment. So we'll just switch over. I think we've given enough time there to switch over and see if we've got answers on that too now. So the answer being 60% of people saying yes, we expect to start trading the market to start trading RFR versus RFR, or local RFR versus the funding currencies overseas on cross-currency swaps, whereas 40% saying actually that there's no change to the market.
Yeah, I just want to mention, I think the result quite makes sense. And, as I mentioned, trading SOFR versus a local RFR, that could, eliminate some of the, basis risk. But I think the consideration in Asia, I think it's more on whether the local RFR have enough depth or liquidity, to support those transactions. And also, I think these questions, the question around cross-currency swap is particularly important in the Asia Pacific, because a lot of corporates or even financial institutions, they are relying on the US dollar funding as a base currency to swap it back to their local currency for the operational use, right? So we have like the issue bonds on one currency and use the CCS to switch it back to another currency for their use. And I think whether they would choose the SOFR versus the local RFR, meaning RFR versus RFR, or the RFR versus IBOR transaction, is really that depends on the other side as well, about the cash product. How would they catch up with the developments of the local RFR?
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting it's an interesting market, and it'll be interesting to see how it develops. Speaking to traders, I think they are very much of the view that it will be RFR versus RFR, but actually speaking to people on funding desks and the like, it seems that they think it's something consistent to what they've done in the past. And really, it's more of an issue for the APAC region, given that in APAC there are going to be a number of multi-curve currencies, which isn't the case overseas. And just, I guess, before we elaborate on that point, but I will just make the comment at LCH, I know HKEX clears some cross-currency swaps. At LCH, we don't, and it's something that we've looked at and something that's certainly been asked about. But we do, and certainly something that we're trying to work out a solution for. But we do have a product swap agent, which essentially, rather than taking the contingent credit risk that you would in a normal clearinghouse, provides all the other functionalities that you would get in a clearinghouse, and does actually trade these, or does allow settlement of these cross-currency swaps at LCH on that side. But for the local Asia-Pacific currencies, do you think, Danny, that the fallbacks will come into play straight away, given that multi-curve currency type environment?
Well, I think the market will continue to develop. While at this point in time, like for example in Hong Kong, the regulators saying we're going to adopt a multi-rate approach. So there's always a questions about the developments of the RFR is a kind of a chicken and egg problems. On one hand, we'll need the cash product to be developed so that we have a hedging needs or a demand for such derivative transactions. But on the other hand, we would like to have a market making derivative market for the issuer to have sufficient instruments for the hedging, right? So I think the market will develop, and I think the CCS would be also a turning point, riding on one part of the trade, one leg that US dollar is going to be converted to the overnight rate, and the other legs, which is in the local currency, that will hopefully drive the local RFL development and close the whole, hold the ecosystem, on the CCS world and also the single interest rate in derivative, trading market.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the challenges, and again to that cross-currency swap question, one of the challenges in this region is that when you've got multi-curves, then you are splitting the liquidity pools. And so you're splitting some, taking Hong Kong dollar market, you've got some liquidity that will go into the highball curve and some that will go into the Honu curve. And so that will create some challenges around that, but at the end of the day, it'll be interesting to see where that liquidity goes. Certainly as the results of that poll suggested, then some of that liquidity will go into the overnight rate, in Honu and Hong Kong dollars, for example. Now, just conscious of time, I think probably we've got just any last comments, Danny?
Yeah, I think before we closing this session, I think the last point I just want to mention is about the basis risk, right? So with the introductions of the RFL and, with the cleared or non-cleared portfolios and the cash products versus the derivatives, I think it's we'd like to just remind all the market participants and all our, key member to pay attention to the basis risk between the cash product and also the cleared and uncleared portfolios. And because of the progress of different IBOR transitions varies, there might be, misalignment of your derivatives and your underlying cash product. So the effectiveness of the existing hedging may be impacted if the derivatives are moving to the overnight rate, but not the cash product. So we advise the key member to closely monitor and manage the basis risk during the benchmark transitions, and be aware the liquidity and the term structure differentials. Once again, the fallback is just the last resort to handle the legacy trade. We recommend active management of your portfolio and take actions to minimize your risk exposure if appropriate. And market participants can consider to convert your IBOR trade in advance or rebook the RFL trade with the compatible economic details, or make use of the basis swap to hedge your risk at your portfolio level. So these are the available tools for all the market participants to consider.
Yeah, Danny, I'd probably reiterate a lot of what you've said there, but probably for me the most important thing and for 2021 is about reducing the outstanding notional in these benchmarks that potentially or probably will fail. And so I reiterate the point that fallbacks are not meant to be the plan A or the number one option. They're plan D, plan E, somewhere down there. And as much as possible, you should be looking about how to transition out of them. And I think probably the second point I would make is that the liquidity is growing in these new rates and it's growing exponentially. And there's a point in time where you need a certain amount of liquidity to switch into them, but you've also got to be aware that you need a certain amount of liquidity to switch out of the existing benchmarks as well. And at some point, both of those things will change. So you just be aware of that and take that into account. So thank you. Thank you for having us today, and thank you for tuning into this session, and thank you for your time.